she steps through the towering gates of Topkapi Palace, the sunlight fading behind her. Beyond these walls lies a world she will never touch again. Family, freedom, the streets where children play. Here, in the Sultan's harem, her life will be measured not by her dreams, but by obedience, whispers, and hidden rules. The stone corridors are cold, the air thick with incense, and from behind heavy doors she can hear the murmurs of other women, some plotting, some crying, all confined. Few will leave. Most will never see the sky again. What did life truly look like behind these walls?
She awoke before sunrise, as she had every day since arriving at the palace, though she no longer remembered how long it had been. The cool air of the Mughal Zenana seeped through the latticed windows, brushing her skin like a reminder that the world outside had ceased to exist for her. The palace gates had swallowed her whole, and the life she had known, her family, the streets, the markets filled with the scent of spices and the laughter of neighbors, had become a memory. Here, in these walls, time moved differently. Every hour, every gesture, every word was measured, recorded, and weighed. The Zenana was vast, almost impossible to imagine from the outside. It was said that the emperor's harem contained thousands of women at any given time. Wives, concubines, attendants, musicians, and servants moved in an intricate, invisible web of rules and obligations. And then there were the eunuchs, guardians, enforcers, the silent eyes that ensured no transgression went unnoticed. To the untrained eye, it might appear as a world of luxury, silk curtains, jeweled ornaments, fountains that sang through the courtyards. But beneath the beauty lay a rigid hierarchy, unspoken tensions, and the constant threat of falling from favor. Her morning began with a careful inspection of her appearance. A silk robe of pale green, embroidered with golden threads, was handed to her by an attendant. She knew the colors marked her rank. A misstep could betray her place in the hierarchy. Some of the women were daughters of princes, some daughters of lesser nobles, and some had been brought from distant lands. All were expected to present themselves in perfect composure, yet none could escape the undercurrent of rivalry. She brushed her hair with painstaking care, aware that one loose strand could invite a whisper, a subtle glance, a judgment. Noor Jahan, the emperor's chief consort and the most powerful woman in the harem, would later become the arbiter of privilege and punishment. Even from her quarters, Noor Jahan's presence was a force felt by every woman in the Zenana. Those who were favored might be allowed to walk in the private gardens, to see the sunlight dance on fountains. Others were confined to the inner chambers, their lives measured in the rhythm of chores, prayers, and the occasional inspection by the eunuchs. The young woman remembered her first day vividly. She had been brought into the Zenana by a eunuch whose face betrayed no emotion. The gates closed behind her with a sound that seemed final, echoing through the stone corridors. She had tried to call for her mother, for anyone, but her voice was swallowed by the vastness of the palace. From that moment, she understood that she was not only a resident, but also a prisoner, bound by rules she could never fully comprehend. Daily life in the harem was a delicate choreography. Mornings began with ablutions and prayers, the women following precise patterns dictated by tradition. Meals were brought silently, and each bite, each sip of sweet sherbet was a ritual in itself. Conversation was regulated. A glance could betray intention, a word could signal ambition. Some women whispered in corners, plotting alliances, exchanging news, or seeking to undermine rivals. Secrets were the currency of power. To survive, one had to learn not only to obey, but also to read the invisible signals. Who smiled at whom, which attendants lingered, which eunuchs observed most closely. Education was not uniform. Some women were allowed tutors, learning Persian poetry, calligraphy, or the Quran. Others spent their days learning embroidery, music, and dance, not as leisure, but as a skill to attract attention or favor. She remembered watching a young concubine practice the sitar for hours, her fingers nimble over the strings, while the shadows of other women crept along the walls, envious and calculating. Every talent, every achievement could elevate or doom a woman, depending on the whims of the emperor or his consorts. The hierarchy was palpable in every interaction. The wives of the emperor, the principal consorts, held absolute sway over those below them, yet even they were not free. Their every action was observed, their words weighed for meaning. Eunuchs patrolled the corridors, silent but vigilant. A misstep, an unintended glance, an untimely laugh could result in punishment or ostracization. Many women endured this quietly, resigning themselves to a life of invisible labor and subtle diplomacy. Competing for favor was constant. She witnessed it in a way women presented themselves to the emperor during audiences, in the careful selection of words during conversations with powerful allies, and in the quiet plotting that occurred behind closed doors. Some women formed alliances, sharing secrets, warning each other of danger. Others betrayed their peers, seeking to rise one step higher in the invisible ladder of power. She learned quickly that trust was dangerous. A whispered confidence could be repeated, twisted, and used as evidence against her. Meals were another theater of observation. Women ate under strict supervision, their behavior carefully monitored. Even laughter could be dangerous if it seemed inappropriate. She watched as a young attendant nervously spilled water, only to be scolded quietly by a senior consort, her mistake recorded in memory, discussed later, perhaps exaggerated, and held over her head. Discipline in the Zenana was subtle, psychological, but relentless. Prayers offered both comfort and constraint. The women knelt in the quiet of their chambers, reciting verses from the Quran, their voices measured and perfect. These moments, though spiritual, were also monitored. Expressions, posture, and attention were evaluated. Deviation could suggest rebellion, doubt, or disrespect. The palace was not merely a home, it was a laboratory of behavior, shaping every thought and action according to invisible rules. Entertainment was tightly controlled. Music, dance, and poetry were allowed, but only under supervision. The emperor's court could summon any woman for performance, a display of skill and obedience. She remembered a young girl, barely 15, performing a classical dance while trembling with fear, her movements scrutinized by the watchful eyes of eunuchs and consorts alike. Perfection was required. Error was dangerous. Isolation weighed heavily on the mind. Letters from home were rare, visits from family rarer. Friendships within the Zenana were fragile, often poisoned by jealousy or rivalry. But in the quiet hours, she would listen to the whispers of other women, their stories, their memories, their hopes. In these whispers, she found companionship, fleeting though it was. They shared strategies, recounted histories, and passed down knowledge that the palace authorities hoped would vanish with time. The corridors of the Zenana were both pathways and prisons. She learned to navigate them carefully, noting the placement of eunuchs, the subtle signs of favor or disfavor, the silent signals of those who controlled access. Each turn could bring opportunity or danger. The layout of the palace itself became a map of social survival, a chart of potential alliances and hidden threats. Over time, she began to understand the politics at play. The emperor's favor was a fickle gift, bestowed and withdrawn with little warning. Some women rose to prominence, enjoying privileges and influence. Others fell into obscurity, forgotten and silenced. The Zenana was a microcosm of the empire itself, a place where power, ambition, and survival intersected in constant tension. Despite the hardships, she found moments of agency. Small victories, a smile from a consort, an opportunity to speak privately with a tutor, a chance to practice her skills, offered brief respite. Each tiny success was a thread she could use to weave a network of support, a way to assert some control in an environment designed to strip her of autonomy. The palace was alive with unspoken rules. Each day she observed the subtle rituals, who bowed to whom, how eyes met, how words were chosen. Every action was a signal, every silence a statement. Learning these codes was essential for survival. She noted the patterns, memorized the hierarchies, and measured every interaction with care. One misstep could be fatal to her standing. One insight could secure favor. Noor Jahan's shadow loomed over all. Even women far from her personal influence felt her reach. Her decisions shaped the lives of hundreds, if not thousands of women. Those who aligned with her gained protection, status, and access to resources. Those who opposed her risked punishment, exile from favor, or worse. The young woman watched, learning not only the rules of conduct, but the subtle strategies of influence that defined power in the harem. Even simple acts, dressing, eating, walking, carried weight. The wrong gesture could invite suspicion, the wrong word could echo in the wrong ear. The palace was a stage, and every woman was both actor and pawn. She understood that her survival depended on perception as much as on action. As the day wore on, the monotony of routines, prayers, meals, lessons, observation created a rhythm that was both comforting and oppressive. Time seemed to stretch, each hour filled with micro-decisions, subtle readings of intention, and the ever-present awareness of being watched. In this rhythm, life continued, but always under the invisible hand of hierarchy and power. By evening, she retreated to her private.
She awoke to the faint echo of footsteps in the corridor outside her chamber, the polished marble cool beneath her feet. The sunlight filtering through the latticed windows of Topkapi Palace cast intricate patterns on the walls, turning every shadow into a potential observer. In this palace, beauty and danger coexisted, woven together like the golden threads in the silks she wore. The Ottoman Imperial Harem was more than a residence. It was a world unto itself, a society ruled by invisible laws, whispers, and eyes that never slept. She moved quietly, as she had learned to do over the months. Every step, every gesture was a statement. The harem was structured with precision. Concubines, wives, mothers of princes, attendants, and the eunuchs who guarded them all. Each had their place, and no one dared overstep. The eunuchs patrolled constantly, a silent army ensuring the boundaries of power were never crossed. To misstep, even slightly, could mean humiliation, or worse. Hurrem Sultan, known to history as Roxolana, was a figure whose presence dominated every corridor, even when unseen. Once a concubine herself, she had maneuvered into the heart of power, becoming the legal wife of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent and a master of court politics. Her story was both a beacon and a warning. She possessed influence few women could imagine, yet she remained confined within the palace walls, subject to constant scrutiny. The women in the harem spoke her name in hushed tones, their voices laced with awe, envy, and caution. She was proof that privilege and imprisonment were not mutually exclusive. They were two sides of the same gilded coin. Daily life began before the sun fully rose. The young woman carried out her ablutions with meticulous care, washing in bowls of scented water and donning garments that marked her rank and favor. Each morning she would pass through the courtyards where fountains murmured, marble statues glistened, and the air smelled faintly of roses and jasmine. Yet despite the beauty, the courtyards were watched. Every smile, every glance, every idle gesture could be interpreted, recorded, and used as currency or weapon. Meals were rituals, not mere sustenance. Servants presented trays laden with delicacies, stews rich with spices, pastries glazed with honey, fruits that had traveled from distant lands. Women ate in silence unless conversation was permitted, and even then their words were measured. A seemingly innocent remark could be twisted, a joke misinterpreted, and alliances shifted in a heartbeat. The young woman had learned to speak cautiously, to listen more than she talked, and to observe the smallest details. In the harem, knowledge was power, and silence could be protection. Education and entertainment were privileges, tightly controlled and laden with expectation. She was trained in calligraphy, the careful tracing of elegant Arabic letters, while other women practiced music or dance. These skills were not just for leisure, they were tools for influence. A well-placed song or a graceful performance could draw attention from the sultan or his favorites, opening doors that were otherwise locked. But with every opportunity came the risk of envy, misjudgment, and the subtle sabotage of rivals. The hierarchy was palpable in every interaction. The mothers of princes, the legal wives and favored concubines wielded authority over those below them. Even among equals, rank dictated who could speak, who could move freely, and who could access the sultan's ear. She observed it constantly, a hand lightly touching a sleeve, a bow given with hesitation, the precise timing of a smile. Every gesture had meaning, and to misread it was to invite danger. Whispers were the currency of the harem. Alliances were forged in shadowed corners, secrets traded for protection, influence, or survival. She learned which women could be trusted, which words could be spoken aloud, and which stories needed to remain behind closed doors. Some alliances were fleeting, dissolving the moment a higher-ranking woman passed by, her gaze sharp and evaluative. Others endured, becoming the fragile scaffolding that allowed women to navigate a world of uncertainty and hidden threat. Hurrem Sultan's own rise was a masterclass in strategy. She had used charm, intelligence, and careful calculation to manipulate court politics, ensuring her influence extended far beyond her chambers. Yet even she was constrained, always navigating the delicate balance between ambition and safety. Her presence reminded every woman that power was attainable but never guaranteed, that privilege carried the weight of constant observation, and survival depended on wit as much as beauty. The young woman's days were regimented. She arose with the light, attended lessons or prayers, performed her duties, and moved carefully among corridors and chambers. Each action was watched, each interaction potentially consequential. She learned to read the subtle cues, a fleeting glance from an attendant, a shift in posture from a favored consort, the faint tension in the eunuch's stance. These details, invisible to outsiders, dictated her behavior and choices. Even leisure was monitored. Music, dance, and storytelling occurred under strict supervision. Improper enthusiasm, a laugh too loud, a gaze too long, each could be interpreted as ambition, insolence, or impropriety. But in those rare moments of genuine expression, the young woman felt a fleeting taste of freedom, a reminder that behind the gilded walls, humanity persisted. She learned to savor these moments, knowing they were temporary and fragile. Isolation was both physical and psychological. Family rarely visited, letters were scarce and censored. Her world was largely confined to the harem, yet she discovered ways to create small pockets of agency. She exchanged knowledge with other women, learned the hidden passages of influence, and observed the routines and moods of those in power. Each piece of information was a tool, a way to protect herself or gain advantage. Danger was constant, though rarely overt. Rivalries could escalate quickly. A misinterpreted gesture, a whispered accusation, or a failed performance could result in banishment from favor, reduced rations, or exile to a less desirable part of the palace. Women learned to navigate the subtleties of courtly life, cultivating patience, adaptability, and keen observation. Mistakes were seldom forgiven, and the consequences could be severe. The courtyard gardens offered a rare semblance of freedom. She walked among the fountains and flowering shrubs, listening to the soft murmur of water and the occasional bird call. Even here, she was never truly alone. Observers lingered, recording behavior, reporting anomalies, ensuring the invisible rules were enforced.
Yet these walks were precious, a chance to breathe, to see the sky, to feel a fleeting connection to a life beyond the walls. She marveled at the women who wielded influence in the harem. Some were mothers of future sultans, shaping the empire from behind the scenes. Others, like Hurrem's sultan, became architects of court politics, their strategies subtle, their reach profound. They demonstrated that confinement did not always mean powerlessness. Intelligence, charm, and patience could carve paths to influence, even under strict supervision. Even rituals were fraught with tension. Daily prayers, dress inspections, and ceremonial appearances required perfection. The wrong gesture, a misaligned veil, or a missed step in protocol could be noticed and remembered. Every moment demanded attention, precision, and a careful reading of the social landscape. In the Ottoman Imperial Harem, survival was mastery of detail as much as mastery of circumstance. Night brought its own challenges. Lights were dimmed, torches flickered, and shadows lengthened along the corridors. Eunuchs continued their patrols, their presence a reminder that observation never ceased. Women retreated to their chambers, whispering strategies, sharing knowledge, and consoling one another in the faint light. The palace was a living organism, its rhythm constant, its rules unyielding, and its inhabitants both actors and prisoners in an intricate, invisible drama. She reflected on Hurrem Sultan's story often, a woman who rose from obscurity to unparalleled influence, yet still confined, still subject to the palace's invisible laws. It was both inspiration and a warning. Ambition was possible, but every gain carried risk, every opportunity had hidden peril, and every advantage could turn into vulnerability. Even small victories mattered. A kind word from a consort, a moment of favor from the sultan, a successful performance or carefully timed joke. These moments were survival, proof that within confinement, women could still assert influence, if only subtly, if only briefly. The harem demanded constant vigilance. Each interaction, each gesture, each expression could shift alliances, determine status, and alter one's fate. The young woman learned to move with grace, speak with precision, and observe with unerring attention. She became attuned to the rhythm of the palace, reading its language in silence.
She awoke to the soft light spilling through the gilded windows of her small chamber at Versailles, the air heavy with the scent of polished wood and candle wax. Outside, the sun had barely begun to touch the manicured gardens, yet the palace was already alive with activity. Footsteps echoed along the marble halls, servants moved with precise purpose, and the courtiers of Louis XIV's court began their measured routines. Here, in the court of the Sun King, every day was a performance, and every woman was both actor and prisoner. As a lady-in-waiting, she understood that her life was no longer her own. Every gesture, every word, every expression was scrutinized, not only by the king, but by those who wielded influence over favor and survival. The palace was immense, a labyrinth of gilded corridors, ornate salons, and hidden staircases. Yet for women like her, the grandeur mattered little. What mattered was how to navigate the endless rituals, the unspoken rules, and the subtle manipulations that governed every interaction. Madame de Menton, a woman whose rise was as remarkable as it was perilous, cast a long shadow over the women of Versailles. Once a governess, she became Louis XIV's secret wife and the power behind the throne in many respects. Her influence was immense, but even she was bound by the rigid etiquette of the court. Her story was a warning and a guide. Ambition could be rewarded, but only if tempered by prudence and adherence to courtly protocol. Those who misjudged their position, who misread the tides of favor, often disappeared into obscurity or scandal. Each morning, the lady-in-waiting's routine began before the palace stirred. She dressed in layers of silk and lace, each garment a marker of rank and station, each ribbon and pearl chosen with precision. Mistakes were not tolerated.
A misplaced cuff, an uneven hem, or an untied ribbon could attract whispers, judgment, and subtle punishment. Every morning was a rehearsal, every action a test of conformity. Breakfast was a silent affair, shared with others of similar rank, yet conversation was carefully monitored. Words were measured, opinions concealed, and gestures practiced to the point of unconscious perfection. Even a smile had to be placed with intent, a nod given only after careful consideration. She learned quickly that the smallest misstep could ripple through the court, affecting favor, access, and reputation. The day's activities were governed by an intricate schedule of rituals. She attended prayers, tutoring, and lessons in etiquette, music, or literature. Some women were trained in painting, others in dance, others in the social arts of conversation and persuasion. Everything was intended to enhance one's worth in the eyes of the king and the powerful consorts who determined favor. Success was rewarded, but error could be punished with social ostracization or exclusion from events that signified influence. The court was a living organism, each individual a cog in a vast ornate machine. Women moved like pieces on a chessboard, each maneuver calculated, each alliance temporary and fragile. Friendships were tested, rivalries inevitable, and observation constant. She had learned to read the subtle cues, a lingering glance, a stiff bow, the inflection of a voice. Each could indicate favor, envy, or hidden danger. Survival depended on perception as much as skill, on discretion as much as loyalty. Madame de Maintenon's presence reminded all women that influence was attainable, yet dangerous. She wielded her position with subtlety, guiding the king's attention, shaping decisions, and controlling access to power. Those who sought to emulate her tactics had to navigate treacherous waters. Ambition without caution was fatal. Prudence without courage led to invisibility. The lady-in-waiting watched, learned, and internalized these lessons, aware that each day could alter her place in the hierarchy. Meals were ceremonial, often public, and always scrutinized. She sat among other women, utensils and plates arranged with precision, conversation carefully timed. Eating was not mere nourishment, but a display of decorum, a test of grace and restraint. A laugh too loud, a bite taken incorrectly, a spill of wine, all could be observed and remembered, woven into the delicate web of social evaluation. The palace itself seemed to watch, a silent arbiter of judgment and control. Isolation, though subtle, was constant. Family visits were rare, letters censored, and the world outside the palace increasingly distant. She relied on other women for companionship, yet even alliances were fraught with uncertainty. Trust was dangerous, secrets could be used as weapons, confidences exploited to elevate one woman at the expense of another. In this environment, social intelligence was as critical as obedience. Rituals dominated every movement. Dressing, walking, speaking, and bowing followed strict protocols. A misstep during a public audience with the king could mean the difference between favor and marginalization. Even the smallest gestures carried weight: the tilt of a head, the placement of a hand, the direction of a gaze. In Versailles, perfection was demanded at every level, and the consequences for failing were swift and enduring. Entertainment and display were tools of influence. Music, dance, and poetry were practiced not only for leisure, but to demonstrate skill, refinement, and obedience. A successful performance could attract favor, while a misstep could provoke ridicule or diminish one's standing. Women performed with precision, knowing that the palace and its residents judged every note, every step, and every expression. Despite the strictures, moments of intimacy and subtle resistance existed. She and a small circle of trusted women exchanged confidences, shared knowledge, and offered consolation. In these private interactions, they carved spaces of agency, creating networks of support that allowed survival in an environment designed to suppress individuality. These clandestine connections were fragile, yet vital. Observation was omnipresent. Madame de Maintenon and other powerful women monitored the interactions of the court, influencing who spoke, who moved, and who rose or fell in the hierarchy. Every detail was noticed and remembered, every deviation recorded. To navigate this landscape, the lady-in-waiting learned the art of subtlety, understanding that influence could be gained through patience, observation, and careful action. Privileges existed, yet they were always tethered to constraint. Access to the king, special audiences, or participation in exclusive events were markers of status, but also of surveillance. Each opportunity brought scrutiny, each honor brought expectation. She experienced the paradox of Versailles, beauty and luxury, yet constant confinement and pressure. Freedom was an illusion, always limited by etiquette, hierarchy, and observation. Psychological strain was pervasive. The need to maintain composure, to observe rules, and to navigate rivalries created tension and anxiety. Sleep was often interrupted by worry or anticipation, as even small mistakes could have far-reaching consequences. The palace demanded vigilance, intelligence, and adaptability at all times. Yet the court also taught resilience. The lady-in-waiting learned to manage her emotions, to read people with precision, and to act strategically. She discovered the subtle ways influence could be exercised, from carefully timed words to gestures of deference. Survival depended on understanding the complex dance of power, favor, and etiquette. Madame de Maintenon's rise illustrated the possibilities and dangers inherent in the court. She demonstrated that women could wield influence, but only within strict constraints, and only through patience, intelligence, and discretion. Her story was a warning and a guide. Ambition could be rewarded, but only if tempered by prudence and adherence to courtly protocol. Those who misjudged their position, who misread the tides of favor, often disappeared into obscurity or scandal. Every day was a negotiation. She moved among salons, corridors, and staircases, always aware of who watched, who listened, and who could manipulate outcomes. Allies were chosen carefully, rivalries navigated discreetly. Survival required strategy, adaptability, and a constant reading of the social environment. Even leisure was fraught with significance. A stroll through the gardens, a quiet conversation, a musical performance, each could be a test, a display, or an opportunity to gain favor. The palace transformed ordinary actions into a web of consequences, and the lady-in-waiting had to learn to move with caution and precision. By evening, exhaustion mingled with vigilance. Chambers were small and private, yet never completely secure. She reflected on the day, on alliances and rivalries, on the ways she had maneuvered through the complex court politics, and on what tomorrow might bring. Survival demanded foresight, strategy, and emotional discipline. The Sun King's palace was both beautiful and merciless. Every corridor, every ritual, every interaction reinforced the power structures that governed women's lives. The lady-in-waiting understood that she was part of a system designed to control, observe, and manipulate, yet within it, she sought small victories and moments of agency. Even as she lay down, the weight of surveillance, ritual, and expectation pressed upon her. Yet resilience persisted.
She had been summoned without warning, her journey to the Forbidden City swift and silent. The red walls loomed ahead, towering over her like guardians of a world she could never hope to fully understand. The gates were vast, painted in vermilion with golden accents that gleamed in the early morning sun, yet they were more than beautiful. They were a barrier, a declaration that beyond them her life belonged not to her, but to the empire. She took a hesitant step forward, heart pounding, knowing that the moment she crossed the threshold, family, freedom, and the familiar streets of her village would vanish forever. Inside, the Forbidden City stretched endlessly, a maze of courtyards, corridors, and chambers designed to impress and intimidate. For women, the inner palaces, known as the harem or the inner court, were both sanctuary and prison.
Here, thousands of women lived under strict rules, each movement, word, and expression scrutinized. Their lives were measured in subtle gestures, rituals, and the approval of those in power. Even the smallest misstep could shift a woman's fortunes, leading to isolation, punishment, or favor lost forever. The young girl was assigned to a modest chamber, one of hundreds where concubines, attendants, and palace women lived. She was taught immediately to observe and obey, for her survival depended entirely on understanding hierarchy and protocol. At the top were the empresses, followed by consorts of varying rank, and below them attendants and servants who ensured the palace operated without flaw. Eunuchs patrolled the corridors constantly, their presence a reminder that deviation from rules was never tolerated. The palace had its own rhythms, its own language, and the ability to interpret these codes could mean the difference between favor and oblivion. She heard whispers of women who had navigated this world successfully. Among them, the young Empress Dowager Cixi had risen from relative obscurity to unprecedented power, demonstrating both cunning and patience. Her story was a lesson. Intelligence, patience, and subtlety could carve pathways to influence, even within the most confining structures. Yet even Cixi's rise came at the cost of personal freedom, alliances constantly shifting, and an awareness that every action carried consequences far beyond what seemed visible. Daily life in the inner palace was regimented. Mornings began with careful ablutions and dressing according to strict protocols. The choice of color, pattern, and accessory was dictated by rank and occasion. Attendants assisted, always alert, correcting mistakes quietly but firmly. The young girl learned quickly that even the smallest error, a misaligned sash, a poorly folded robe, could invite reprimand or gossip that echoed through the corridors for days. Her body learned the precision demanded by hierarchy, her mind the constant calculation of behavior. Meals were not merely sustenance, they were lessons in etiquette and hierarchy. Women ate according to rank, their seating, posture, and timing carefully dictated. Conversation was minimal and carefully measured, as words could reveal ambition, ignorance, or disrespect. The taste of food was secondary to the subtle social lessons embedded in every bite. She observed those above her, noting how favored concubines moved, how they spoke, and how they used small gestures to maintain influence. Every nuance was a guide to survival. Isolation weighed heavily. Letters from home were rare, visits almost non-existent. The world outside the walls became a distant memory, replaced by the constant awareness of surveillance and hierarchy. She learned to rely on secret networks among the women. Attendants exchanged information discreetly, concubines whispered warnings, and minor alliances formed the backbone of survival. These networks were fragile and often temporary, but they offered the only protection in an environment designed to suppress individuality and agency. Rivalries were constant and subtle. The young woman observed how a glance, a slight hesitation, or an overheard conversation could shift a woman's fortunes. Secrets were currency, and betrayal was always a possibility. She quickly understood that trust was dangerous, and survival required both discretion and keen observation. Alliances had to be maintained carefully, loyalty tempered by pragmatism, and ambition concealed beneath humility. Education and entertainment were controlled instruments of influence. She learned embroidery, calligraphy, and classical poetry, skills that could demonstrate refinement to the emperor or senior consorts. Music, dance, and ritual performance were practiced for hours under supervision. Success could attract attention and favor. Failure could result in punishment or exclusion. These lessons taught more than skill. They taught strategy, patience, and awareness of how every action could be interpreted politically. The palace itself was alive with invisible rules. She noted how courtyards were arranged, how pathways guided interactions, and how the slightest deviation could attract scrutiny. She learned to move in ways that suggested compliance without weakness, observation without suspicion. Every interaction, whether with a fellow concubine, an attendant, or a eunuch, required calculation. Her life became a constant balance between appearing unassuming and maintaining visibility to gain protection or influence.
Privileged women, like the consorts closest to the emperor, wielded limited influence, yet were ever constrained by surveillance and etiquette. They shaped events behind the scenes, manipulating alliances and strategy, but always under the omnipresent gaze of palace officials. Even the empress herself was subject to scrutiny, her power mediated by ritual, protocol, and the shifting dynamics of the inner court. The young woman observed, learned, and internalized these lessons, recognizing that influence could be achieved, but only with vigilance, subtlety, and careful negotiation. Even leisure was structured. Walks through the inner gardens, conversation during tea, and music sessions were opportunities to observe, align, and influence. Every gesture, expression, and word was noted. Mistakes could have long-lasting consequences. Success could be rewarded, but came with expectation and scrutiny. The young woman learned to find small spaces of autonomy, carving moments of privacy and personal expression without attracting attention. Psychological pressure was immense. Sleep was often interrupted by anxiety over alliances, missteps, or potential punishment. Her thoughts became strategies, her imagination a tool to anticipate challenges. She learned patience, caution, and observation, understanding that survival required mental acuity as much as obedience. In the silence of her chamber, she reflected on the precarious balance of power, the invisible rules that governed every gesture, and the subtle art of navigating life in confinement. Over time, she developed an understanding of coded communication. A glance, a gesture, or a carefully placed word could convey messages across corridors and chambers without drawing the attention of officials. Women used these techniques to warn one another, to coordinate subtle acts of influence, and to protect themselves in a world where exposure could be dangerous. These secret networks were fragile but vital, forming the hidden architecture of survival. Observation was constant. Eunuchs patrolled relentlessly, senior consorts monitored interactions, and even minor attendants had eyes and ears everywhere. She learned to interpret these signals, noting patterns of behavior, predicting shifts in favor, and navigating rivalries with care. Awareness became as crucial as skill. Knowledge of the palace's invisible rules was survival itself. The young girl also learned resilience through small victories. A successful performance in music, a careful alliance with an influential concubine, or an opportunity to converse discreetly with a senior woman became markers of progress. These moments, though minor, were critical to her psychological endurance. They reminded her that even within confinement, agency could be exercised and influence carefully cultivated. Isolation was paradoxical. Surrounded by women, yet profoundly alone, she relied on observation, strategy, and subtle negotiation to maintain her position. Friendships and alliances were formed cautiously, each interaction measured for risk and potential reward. Betrayal could come from the closest companion, and trust had to be earned through shared experience and mutual benefit. The architecture of the palace reinforced control. Hallways, courtyards, and chambers were designed to guide movement, limit unsupervised interaction, and ensure the hierarchy was maintained. She memorized these patterns, understanding how to move strategically, when to appear visible, and when to remain unseen. Every passage, each room, each staircase held lessons about power, access, and influence. Privilege existed, but always intertwined with constraint. Access to the emperor, proximity to powerful consorts, and participation in ceremonial events offered opportunities for influence, but brought scrutiny and expectation. Every action, every gesture, and every interaction had consequences, reinforcing the delicate balance between power and imprisonment. The young woman witnessed the rise of Empress Dowager Cixi, who demonstrated that intelligence, patience, and strategic alliances could translate confinement into influence. Yet Cixi's life also illustrated the cost. Vigilance, constant negotiation, and awareness of hidden dangers were essential. Success within the palace came at the expense of personal freedom, emotional certainty, and at times morality. Night brought minimal relief. Torches flickered in corridors, eunuchs patrolled tirelessly, and whispers of alliances, rivalries, and plots traveled along shadowed walls.
Across continents and centuries, a pattern emerges. Women in the palaces of the Mughal Empire, the Ottoman court, Versailles, and the forbidden city of Qing China lived lives of privilege and power, yet were bound by rules they could neither escape nor challenge. Each palace, though separated by geography and culture, became a stage where women's freedom was exchanged for visibility, where influence was measured by compliance, and where survival depended on obedience, subtlety, and relentless vigilance. In the Mughal harem, the Zenana was a labyrinth of corridors, chambers, and secret rooms where women were trained in poetry, music, and courtly arts, but also in silence, observation, and restraint. Even figures like Nur Jahan, whose intellect and political skill allowed her to wield significant influence, remained confined within these walls. She moved through a gilded cage, her power inseparable from her imprisonment. For every victory she achieved, countless other women lived unseen, forgotten, or erased, their voices never recorded, their suffering unacknowledged. The Ottoman Imperial Harem mirrors this reality. Hurrem's sultan, once Roxolana, rose from obscurity to become the legal wife of Suleiman the Magnificent, exercising influence in decisions that shaped an empire. Yet even her reach was bounded by palace walls and strict protocol. The other women, the concubines, attendants, and secondary consorts, lived in constant vigilance, their bodies and behaviors scrutinized, their ambitions measured and constrained. They maneuvered through invisible hierarchies, forming temporary alliances, whispering secrets, and mastering the delicate art of survival. For most, daily life was a negotiation between desire, fear, and the relentless reality of confinement. At Versailles, ladies-in-waiting and queens alike were trapped within the rituals and etiquette of the Sun King's court. Every gesture, every phrase, every smile was observed and evaluated. Even Madame de Maintenon, who became the king's secret wife and wielded influence over court politics, was subject to scrutiny and manipulation. Ordinary women endured psychological strain, forced to maintain appearances while navigating rivalries that could determine whether they would be remembered or erased. The court demanded perfection, yet offered only partial reward, and history often ignored those whose voices were confined within its walls. The inner palaces of Qing China were no different. Empress Dowager Cixi, who rose from obscurity to become one of the most powerful women in Chinese history, started as a concubine in the Forbidden City. Her ascent required patience, alliances, and a careful reading of the palace's invisible rules. But behind her story lay thousands of women who entered the palace as children and lived entire lives in isolation, subject to surveillance, hierarchy, and psychological pressure. They were trained to obey, to observe, and to communicate subtly, often through coded gestures or whispered warnings. Their existence was both protected and constrained, their voices almost entirely absent from the historical record. Across these palaces, certain patterns emerge with striking clarity. Women were confined physically, restricted in movement, and monitored constantly. Their behaviors were controlled through ritual, hierarchy, and psychological pressure. They were taught obedience, patience, and subtlety, while their personal ambitions and desires were subordinated to the palace and its rulers. Alliances, friendships, and even love became tools of survival rather than expressions of freedom. Privilege was inseparable from imprisonment. But perhaps the most insidious pattern was erasure. Chroniclers, historians, and official records focused almost exclusively on rulers, wars, and male achievements. The experiences of women, their suffering, ingenuity, and resilience were rarely documented. Even figures like Nur Jahan, Hurrem's sultan, Madame de Maintenon, and Empress Dowager Cixi appear primarily through the lens of power and politics, rather than the deeply personal struggles, isolation, and risks they endured daily. For the majority of women, their stories were never told, leaving gaps in history where their lives once existed. Consider the story of Gulbadan Begum, the Mughal princess who wrote the Humayun Nama, a rare account of life in the Mughal court.
Her observations offer glimpses into the restricted lives of women, their rivalries, and the subtle power they wielded. Yet even her writing survives as an exception rather than the rule. Or the lesser-known concubines of the Ottoman harem, many of whom never appear in chronicles, but whose labor, loyalty, and suffering sustained the palace's daily functioning. Their names are lost, their lives reduced to whispers and shadows. In Versailles, countless women served quietly, attending the king and the court, navigating alliances, and enduring humiliation or neglect without recognition. Many left no record, their voices absorbed into the grandeur of court life, their contributions and struggles invisible to history. Similarly, in the Forbidden City, thousands of palace women were bound by ritual, hierarchy, and surveillance. Few left letters, diaries, or records that survived. Even Empress Dowager Cixi's early life is reconstructed largely from secondary accounts, highlighting how the experiences of women were often mediated, distorted, or hidden entirely. The consequences of this erasure are profound. By privileging the narratives of rulers and public events, history has minimized the psychological toll, the social constraints, and the resilience of women in these palaces. It has presented a version of the past that celebrates grandeur and power while ignoring the daily reality of those who lived, loved, and struggled behind the walls. Their confinement, isolation, and ingenuity are often invisible, leaving gaps in our understanding of historical societies. Yet, through careful scholarship and storytelling, glimpses of these lives can be recovered. The letters, memoirs, and rare first-hand accounts reveal resilience, strategy, and courage. Women adapted to their circumstances, forming alliances, mastering protocols, and exercising influence subtly, even when freedom was impossible. Their stories challenge the dominant narrative of history as a chronicle of rulers alone, illuminating the human cost of power, the intricacies of survival, and the persistence of agency in constrained circumstances. For instance, Hurrem Sultan's influence shaped the policies of the Ottoman Empire, yet she lived entirely within the harem's confines. Nur Jahan guided Mughal politics, yet her daily life was dictated by harem hierarchies. Madame de Maintenon wielded quiet power at Versailles, yet was trapped by etiquette, surveillance, and the king's favor. Even Empress Dowager Cixi, whose political reach extended to governance, experienced confinement, restriction, and the constant risk of elimination in her early years. Each example demonstrates the paradox of power within limitation. Women could influence history while simultaneously being denied agency over their personal lives. These patterns force reflection on the nature of historical memory itself. Whose stories are recorded and whose are silenced, whose experiences shape our understanding of the past and whose are erased. By examining these forgotten lives, we gain insight not only into the operations of palaces and courts, but into the broader structures of gendered oppression that persist across time and geography. History, it seems, has always been selective, recording the actions of those deemed powerful while omitting the contributions, suffering, and strategies of those confined and invisible. Even today, the silence of these women resonates. Their struggles remind us that power and confinement are often intertwined, that visibility does not guarantee freedom, and that the resilience of the human spirit can flourish even in the most restricted circumstances. The whispered alliances, secret strategies, and daily ingenuity of women across empires and continents offer lessons about endurance, intelligence, and subtle resistance, lessons too often overlooked in traditional histories. Consider the forgotten concubines of the Qing dynasty, who navigated a labyrinth of hierarchy and ritual with no promise of recognition. Consider the ladies-in-waiting at Versailles, who moved through gilded halls, shaping courtly dynamics while remaining invisible to chroniclers. Consider the silent women of the Mughal and Ottoman palaces, whose labor and diplomacy sustained courts, yet went unrecorded. Their experiences, though largely hidden, revealed the psychological complexity, social negotiation, and survival skills required to endure lives of confinement and limited agency. The erasure is not merely academic, it is human. Each unwritten story represents a life constrained, a mind tested, and a spirit that adapted within impossible boundaries. These women's lives were rich with observation, strategy, and resilience, yet history often overlooks them in favor of rulers, battles, and monuments. By reconstructing their experiences, even partially, we honor the complexity of their existence and challenge the notion that history is only made by those in public view. As we consider the Mughal Zenana, the Ottoman Harem, Versailles, and the Forbidden City, a clear image emerges. A world of restriction, surveillance, and psychological pressure where women navigated intricate hierarchies, exercised covert influence, and endured isolation. These shared patterns transcend culture and geography, revealing universal aspects of palace life: privilege inseparable from confinement, influence entangled with observation, and resilience forged through constraint. Yet even in confinement, their humanity persisted. Moments of laughter, friendship, secret communication, and subtle manipulation punctuated their days. Small victories, carefully claimed, became lifelines. The women